So, as I promised, I've seen one participant already. Would you please introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. Good morning. My name is Veronika Jemelíková. I'm a student of Security Studies here on Charles University. Thank you for all the contribution. I have one question. So we heard a lot about Iran, we heard a lot about North Korea, but I think all these countries are being put on a spotlight, while one that is, in my view, much bigger threat, Pakistan, is not being talked about at all. And when you said that 2015 everything will be peachy and glass will be full and very tasty, I think 2015, 1 year after the troops are withdrawn from Afghanistan, 1 year after presidential election in Afghanistan, when Pakistan will probably have a lot of influence over that. And when Camille was mentioning that actually Iran, we should talk about the potential of conflict in the region, why is Pakistan not being talked about? The region it can be very much destabilized by this country, which has nuclear weapons, which is not signatory to NPT. And if Iran withdraws its signature, does it mean the sanctions will be withdrawn? Why Iran has sanctions while Pakistan has none? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jakub Kulhanek, the Association for International Affairs. Allow me, well, first of all, thank you for your excellent presentations. And allow me to play devil's advocate here. You touched on China's growing arsenal. I wonder to what extent perhaps the continuing evolution of the missile defense might act as a spoiler here, sort of trying to undermine China's willingness to engage the United States and the West in its effort to push for a more robust disarmament. And I mean, if you take it, perhaps a step further, obviously this ties into a much broader issue, and that's the linkage between offensive and defensive capabilities. And I think that hasn't been sufficiently addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Who's going to take the question about Pakistan, then China, and okay, Camille and Gary, probably, yeah? Okay, so who's...
Okay. Well, it was an excellent question about Pakistan. And the reason why none of us mentioned it is because this is a panel on the NPT, and Pakistan isn't in the NPT. But I think your point is absolutely correct. And actually Camille alluded to this. The risk of nuclear war is probably greater in South Asia than anywhere in the world, where we have an active conflict between two countries who've fought a number of wars. We have a nuclear buildup, including what appears to be a move toward the development of battlefield or tactical nuclear weapons, which of course lowers the nuclear threshold. And we as a community have not been able to find a way to stop the nuclear developments in India and Pakistan, although tremendous efforts have been made to try to do that. We have been unsuccessful. I think as in most of these nuclear arms races, unless you address the underlying political conflict and security concerns, you're not going to be able to deal with the symptoms, which is the perceived need to expand and develop nuclear weapons. And of course, that's easier said than done. I mean, there's a reason why India and Pakistan have been, have had tensions for over 50 years, so there's no near-term solution to that. But unless we can address that underlying political conflict, I doubt very much we'll be able to constrain the buildup of nuclear forces in South Asia. On China and missile defense, I agree there's a connection between offense and defense. And I think the challenge for the United States is to build up our missile defenses against countries that have relatively small and primitive nuclear and missile forces, like North Korea or potentially Iran, without at the same time threatening the strategic forces of larger countries with more sophisticated nuclear and missile forces like China and Russia. And if we can't find a way to meet that challenge, then I do think our missile defense program will ultimately stand in the way or make it more difficult to achieve further reductions. We think there's a way to do that because the forces that we're putting, the missile defense forces we're putting into both Asia and Europe are so small and modest, they're sufficient to deal with on Iran or North Korea, but in our view, they can't possibly threaten the strategic capabilities of China and Russia, and therefore we hope we can convince Moscow and Beijing that that shouldn't stand in the way of at least stabilizing, if not reducing, their nuclear forces. Thank you.
One additional thought on Pakistan. Of course, the international community and NPT member states have to keep encouraging and pressuring both Pakistan and India to move closer to the global non-proliferation regime. But as Gary Samer just pointed out, the basic work has to be done by these countries themselves. And there are at least some positive elements there. For instance, there is a bilateral agreement between Pakistan and India about notification on missile launches with the objective to avoid a misunderstanding with potential disastrous consequences. And that is a transparency measure. We already mentioned the utility of transparency measures. It could be used also to bring Pakistan and India closer to the multilateral efforts we are making in this respect, which is the Hague Code of Conduct on transparency about missile proliferation. And so there is an inroad there, maybe also in this aspect, to draw these countries closer into the global regime, and I think that's where we have to keep working.
Just a couple of additional thoughts on the issue of Pakistan. Indeed, I mean, if to use a coin phrase, I mean that should be the issue that keeps us awakened at night when dealing with nuclear issues in many ways, for a variety of reasons. They've been transferring nuclear technology, so we know that the AQ-CAN network has been more or less dismantled, but we can't be sure that it will not continue. And this is a major concern with Pakistan, others as well, such as North Korea, but with Pakistan, there are very serious concern about that. They have because of their inherent conventional weakness vis-à-vis their Indian neighbor, they put themselves in a situation where the early use of nuclear weapon in the event of a crisis or a conflict is considered as a very serious option. That's the debate about what is called the cold start on their part, which would be indeed the single case where nuclear use could be envisaged very early in a crisis, giving us little time and little chances of preventing that. And all of this, I think it's, of course, mostly their responsibility. There are no reason why Pakistan should not behave like a responsible actor, but we also need to be making very clear to them, outside the NPT context, they are not an NPT party, they are not in non-compliance with the NPT because they never signed it, so we can't use the NPT logic per se, but by engaging them so that at least as interim measures, they address some of these concerns that we have for the broader regime. On China and missile defense, I would say two things. One is, I think one of the biggest issue with China is that, in fact, we don't know where they are or where they are going. And this is part of the problem. We have no clue about the exact size of the stockpile, of the directions they are taking. We understand there is a modernization process underway, but how far does it want to go? And this is now, as this has started weighing on the overall process, because when you discuss in Moscow or in Washington, the size of the Chinese arsenal has started being part of the calculus for how low can they go without knowing where the Chinese are. So that's one part of the equation. The second part on missile defense is that indeed missile defense is an important factor for any small nuclear force. when making its calculation. I mean, the French and the British for a number of years, and to a certain extent still today, do factor in the Russian missile defense capabilities as part of their, so the sizing of their arsenal. So this is something that has to be taken into account in some ways. What I would say about that is that strategic stability, that is this notion that was very central during the Cold War in the US-Soviet relation, probably needs to be rethought through in a context of multiplayers, in a context where missile defense have become and will remain an important part of the strategic posture of the United States in particular, but also of its allies. And in many ways, we can't really go against that. You know, when the Japanese or the Koreans are developing missile capabilities, missile defense capabilities, I tend to see it as good news when we know that there is a debate in some of the, in Japan, for instance, on the nuclear option. So maybe it's better that they go for a missile capability, an anti-missile capability, than that they start contemplating too seriously the nuclear option. So this is a very sophisticated debate with many factors, and it's not as obvious as the Chinese will continue to build up as long as they don't have reassurances about the American forces. This is a factor that they all play together.
Any other contributions? Okay, please. You know, and behind you and then you.
Hello, Excellencies. My name is George Tabe. I'm a student of the International Relations and in the Faculty of International Relations and European Studies at the Metropolitan University. Thank you so much, Excellencies, for your good comments and nice presentation, which is, I believe, is going to contribute to my knowledge as well. Ladies and gentlemen, you're all welcome. Thank you very much. Sir, I'm much more concerned about the Iranian issue. As of today, we very well know that nuclear weapons remains the ultimate security guarantee of every state. Why? Because of the U.S. Constant aggressive attitude, using of drones, targeted killings in the parts of Pakistan has created so much fear into other states in the form that there is no more guarantee if you don't have a nuclear weapon. I will give an example to you. We have Libya. When Libya was pursuing nuclear weapons in the 80s, Muammar Gaddafi was attempted to be killed several times by President Reagan, but he was unsuccessful. And then Libya was very strong and defensive because it had the ambitions of nuclear weapons and they were not transparent in their NPTs. Now that Iran is in the same case, and Iran now lies at a very geostrategic position, if Iran gives off its nuclear weapons, it will be attacked. This is a deja vu. We saw that already with Libya. Libya gave up and Libya was attacked. Muammar Gaddafi is dead today. Now, why can't the United States sign a security guarantee as it did after the Sinai crisis between Israel and Egypt, and as it did after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki between Japan? Why can't the U.S. not come up with a security guarantee today? And I'm very, very sure if the UN does that, Iran is going to be transparent and it will give up in nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's face the question.
Sure. Well, I agree with you that part of Iran's motivation for pursuing a nuclear weapons capability is fear of the United States. I think, in addition, the Iranians see themselves as naturally the dominant power in the Persian Gulf, and they also believe that having nuclear weapons or a nuclear weapons capability will help them to assert that dominance. So I think the Iranian motivation is partly defensive, partly ambitious, which is true with most countries. I also agree with you that an ultimate solution to the nuclear issue will have to involve some kind of security guarantee or assurance from the United States to Iran. And in particular, we've tried very hard. President Obama has made it very clear that it's not our intent, it's not our policy to overthrow the Islamic Republic. Our concern is about the nuclear weapons program in Iran and what that means in terms of threats to the U.S. and our allies in the region, and the danger to further proliferation in the Middle East and to the NPT itself, as we've talked about. So I think you're right that we will have to overcome the very deep suspicion that the Iranians have that any concession they make on the nuclear issue will only embolden the United States to make further demands And that's certainly one of the challenges we have, especially because the Iranians just won't talk to us. It's very difficult to provide reassurance to somebody if they refuse to speak to you. And I'm hoping that as these P5+1 negotiations with Iran proceed, the Iranians will develop the courage to actually have a meeting with the United States so we can talk about these fundamental security issues. But until they do that, it's difficult for us to, actually communicate to them if they're not willing to talk to us.
Additional comment. There are 185 countries in the world that have chosen to renounce nuclear weapon states. All of them are not in good relations with the United States or the West. I don't necessarily believe that the pursuit of nuclear weapons is enhancing Iranian security, nor that it did enhance the security of Iraq, Libya, or others. What strikes me when looking at the Iranian file in the long term, in the last 10, 15 years, is to see how big were the offers made to Iran, with a combination of economic benefits, of diplomatic engagement, of recognition of the Iranian pivotal role in the Middle East and beyond, on the fact that they had a say in the affairs of Iraq, of Afghanistan, and so on, and that this was recognized. On the transfers of technology, because contrary to what the Iranians say, they've been offered transfers of technology, and the construction of the nuclear reactor by Russia has continued in spite of the crisis and was completed. And I think in a way, Iran is a very large and significant country in the Middle East with a very educated population, and it really is up to the Iranian leadership to come with this decision to sort of cross the Rubicon towards engagement with the rest of the world on this. And in spite of all these offers that were made to them, they consistently refused to do that over the last 10 years. They deepened their case, or they make their case worse by taking further steps that were raising the criticism about their nuclear capabilities. And by doing that, they were isolating not only themselves, but their population from the benefits of being part of globalization, when Iran, as a major country in the Middle East with a fantastic both natural and human resources, could be a central player in the 21st century had it not chosen that path. And this is, I think, something that we need to take into account. When you look at North Korea, when you look at Iran, indeed they have security issues with the United States in particular. But on the other hand, the choice made by these regimes have completely isolated them from the rest. And you see that when even those so-called rogue states, I don't like the expression, the minute they make a decision to engage, look at Burma today. Everyone is so happy to engage them. Mrs. Clinton immediately flew to Rangoon, and even if the process was not completed. So I don't see this sort of situation where they have no other choice but to go nuclear. There is an alternative path that they've not taken.
Gentleman in the first row.
Hello, I'm Christopher Jonker. I'm the Deputy Head of Mission of the Netherlands Embassy here in Prague. And in my previous job, I was also working on non-proliferation. I was the Deputy Head of the Non-Proliferation and Arms Control Division, so I worked with a lot of you behind the table. Thank you very much for all your presentations. I think you made some very important points with a new start of the agenda. I think from the Netherlands perspective, we've always also tried to use the bridge year together with Germany and the other 8 countries Stefan already named in the MPDI to continue working on the action points we decided on in New York in 2010. And I think that is the strength of the MPT, and I think we should all emphasize that all the time because, of course, we're dealing with a very important non-compliance issue. We've been discussing it over and over already this hour again. But at the same time, the MPT was able to survive that and stand up as well. And I think as you look at the P5+1 talks, we are united there. in trying to convince Iran to cooperate with us and to join the world in a way. I have one question for the panel, or it's a little bit following on what Camille ended with, and that is the three pillars. And the third pillar we're always forgetting about in a way, because we're all focusing on disarmament, non-proliferation. They are the more sexy issues which reach the newspapers as well, but the peaceful use is very important. It comes with, indeed, as Camille said, with commitments and responsibilities for all countries to work on. I think in that light the Nuclear Security Summit is a good example where we have a group of countries also try to cooperate and improve our commitments and responsibilities towards the nuclear technology we're all using. The question is, how are we going to show that it's not only non-proliferation and disarmament, but that peaceful uses might be the key to the solution also for Iran maybe, but also in Europe and in Asia and in countries like Burma, or maybe even in Africa where the need for energy is growing and growing. How will we keep that pillar alive and strong as needed as well? Thank you.
Thank you. Bruno?
Thank you, Jiří. I was a little bit intrigued by Gary's comment about the value of security guarantees as part of the process designed to solve the Iranian nuclear issue. Contrary to what the gentleman who raised the question beforehand puts it, the Iranians have made it clear over and over and over since 2005 that they are no longer interested in security guarantees. Security guarantees for Iran is very 2004. It's so 2004. The team that arrived and conducted negotiations under direct control of the Supreme Leader's office after 2006, or those who were in the back channels, and we've all been part of back channel negotiations with Iran, made it clear that they are not interested in security guarantees because they don't believe them. So even though I take your point, Gary, that no ultimate solution to the whole Iranian issue is possible without some form of security guarantee, but that's putting the cart before the horse in a sense, although of course you know it, but that assumes, of course, that trust and confidence has been restored on both sides. Security guarantees could only be something that crown the process, not something that trigger the process with the current regime. So you're talking about a situation where this is no longer the same regime because by definition its behavior has changed so much that it cannot be the same regime. So I was a little bit intrigued by your insistence on this, and I thought maybe I'm missing something. Maybe, in fact, behind the surface, the Iranians are telling you, or telling you, the Americans telling others, that we are actually interested in American security guarantee. If that's the case, that's news to me. That's welcome, because that's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. I'm still a little bit intrigued. I have a specific question for you, Gary, about what happens next year, starting next year, what happens in the next 4 years if President Obama is re-elected. What is your personal view of what the priorities of the Obama administration could be in the field of arms control and disarmament? Of course, I assume you will tell me it depends a lot on what Congress, on the shape of the Congress, but can you give us a little sense of how you personally would like to see the agenda, the Prague Agenda for the next 4 years if President Obama is re-elected? Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman next to you, yes.
Thank you. I'm from Republic of Korea. I'm representing for the Nuclear Security Summit, but taking this opportunity, I'd like to mention my observation on North Korean case, as there is some several intervention on this particular issue. Although recent movement in North Korea is really front page of the all international media, even though that episode is regarding missile test, but I think there is no clear distinction between missile program as well as their nuclear weapons program, because they would like to miniaturize their nuclear capabilities and also they would like to possess, their delivery means with, length as well as accuracy. So, even though they mentioned this is, peaceful use of space with satellite launch, but as we have in UN Security Council resolution, any launch using ballistic missile technology has been prohibited by the consensus. And from 1998, they have, until now, they have 4 rounds of missile launch. But I think their nature of launch is remain unchanged, starting from 1998. Even though there is some failure in this recent launch, but that does not mean, that does not diminish seriousness of this missile program, because even though there is a failure, they will learn some lessons, and then they will reinforce their missile capabilities. It's quite happy to see that UN Security Council responded in a very swift manner, and then unequivocal manner to take a statement on North Korea's missile program with strong condemn, and then ready to respond correspondingly if there is any further missile test or nuclear test. I think it is very important to, when you talk about NPT regime, and then we have to vigilant and then ready to respond with one voice to North Korea's provocation. Because even though we have a 6-party talks process on denuclearization of North Korea, but I think international community's voice is very important, so that North Korea cannot continue this defiant gesture. We understand that, I think their emboldened gesture on this missile test, even though they have agreement with the United States in February 29, but I think it's more or less their, because of their domestic commitment for the strong and prosperous nation with the new leadership. But we have to show them in the international context, international community's voice is much important than their domestic reason. I think this is important, posture of the international community. And as mentioned by previous speakers on security guarantee, also can be applied to North Korea's case. But North Korea's, their argument on hostile policy of the U.S. Is always problematic, but they don't define this hostile policy, So I think security guarantee could be a sort of, excuse, to develop their nuclear weapons program. Final point is, I think this North Korea nuclear case issue, as well as Iranian nuclear issue, is interlinked, more or less. So I think if we can address North Korea's nuclear case in a very effective manner, and have some progress on this side, can give a positive impact to Iranian nuclear case too. So I think so we have to ready to respond swiftly and strongly on North Korea's nuclear program. Thank you.
Thank you. I now ask the panelists to respond. We have the 3 clusters of question. One is a peaceful use and the cooperation in nuclear. I would also refer to the second panel, which is very much about this part of the NPT package. And security guarantees and the future or priorities of President Obama if elected, and the North Korean case. and also related to security guarantees. So who's going to take first? Stefan?
On North Korea, I can only subscribe to everything you said. I think we need to have a firm and resolve on the part of the international community to tackle this issue. Certainly the way the international community handles these two key proliferation cases, North Korea and Iran, will be decisive for the future of the non-proliferation regime. On the question about the third pillar and its future, as you know, Germany made a political decision after Fukushima to phase out nuclear energy production, which does not mean that Germany intends to step out of the third pillar of the NPT, because peaceful uses of nuclear energy is much broader than energy production. It covers also applications in medicine, in research. So there remains a broad scope for cooperation on these issues. Even on the issue of nuclear energy production, of course, every country remains entirely free to decide on its own energy mix. And for those countries who remain on the path of the use of nuclear energy production, it is very important that the further development of their national programs take place in the best possible safety and security conditions. And I think there is still a broad scope for international cooperation on these issues. Thank you.
Well, to answer Bruno's question, I only have to guide you to President Obama's speech in Seoul when he was there for the Nuclear Security Summit. And the speech, which those of you who haven't read it, it was intended to be both sort of an accounting of where we are in the Prague Agenda, but also an indication of what his priorities are should he be reelected. And the speech really mentions three main areas. First is Iran and North Korea, which we've already talked about as two nuclear proliferation challenges that directly threaten the United States and our allies, and which are terribly difficult issues to resolve. I mean, we've been grappling with the Iran and the North Korea problem for well over 20 years. And I don't imagine that they're going to be easily resolved, but we have to try to find a way as best we can to try to slow down, contain, and hopefully in the case of Iran, prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons. So that will undoubtedly be a very significant issue for President Obama in his second term. And on the question of security guarantees, I wasn't talking so much about a formal written piece of paper as the sense, trying to create a sense of assurance in Tehran that they can make concessions on the nuclear issue without facing an existential threat. I don't know whether it's possible to give that kind of confidence and assurance, but I think unless we can overcome the Supreme Leader's fear that the United States is determined to destroy the Islamic Republic, I doubt very much we'll see a permanent resolution of the nuclear issue, just sort of tactical concessions necessary to avoid economic and political and military pressure as opposed to a real resolution. The second issue that President Obama talks about in his Seoul speech is U.S. and Russia. I mean, the president is genuinely believes that the reset in U.S.-Russian relations was one of the big achievements in his first term. And one element of that was progress in making further reductions in strategic forces. And I think the president understands that to make further reductions, we're going to have to address the issue of missile defense as well as other issues that might stand in the way of further reduction. So I believe he will hope to move forward with Russia, with President Putin, in a second term if he's given that opportunity. And the third issue, of course, is nuclear security. I mean, the first nuclear security summit in Washington in 2010, then the Seoul summit, which was a big success in terms of actions that have been taken by the countries that participate and commitments that have been made for the next nuclear security summit, which will be held in the Netherlands in 2014. And that is an issue that President Obama has a very deep commitment to because he, A, believes that if terrorists ever got their hands on nuclear weapons, it would be an earth-shaking event. But B, he thinks it's an issue on which countries that normally fight with each other in the non-proliferation and disarmament space can actually work together, because whether it's NPT parties or non-NPT parties, weapon states or non-weapon states, industrial countries or developing countries, we all have a common interest in making sure that nuclear materials and facilities are secure so that terrorists or criminals can't acquire nuclear weapons. And one of the great pleasures, as Chung-hee knows, about working in the nuclear security area is that we've tried to some extent to avoid, and I'm sure you'll talk about this in the afternoon panel, I think to some extent we've been able to neutralize some of the old debates and focus on a practical common objective, and to some extent neutralize the kind of theological issues that always crop up in the NPT context. Thank you.
On North Korea, all I can do is just concur completely with what Ambassador Han has said. On Christopher's issue on the question of peaceful uses of nuclear energy, it is the case that the NPT review cycle tends to focus a lot on the issues of compliance with commitments on the part of the nuclear weapon states with their disarmament commitments, and on the question of compliance and more non-compliance with non-proliferation commitments. And then there's also the issue of the Middle East. On the peaceful uses, most of the agreements have already been reached, and we're now in an implementation phase, which goes quite smoothly with the IAEA. And on both non-proliferation and peaceful use, we have the IAEA as an agency which works very effectively in implementing, in supporting implementation of those commitments. And I think that that's one of the main reasons why the peaceful uses doesn't feature as prominently. It's not one of, as you have said very rightly, it's not one of the headline issues that one hears about in the NPT context. But I think that much of this is because a lot of the work is done in Vienna through the IAEA framework.
A couple of quick additions. On the issue of North Korea, I think one of the reasons we can't, even from this part of the world, not take seriously the North Korean issue is that the North Koreans are spreading the technology. They've spread the missile technology. We have a lot of the missile programs and missile problems that we face have to do with the fact that the North Koreans have sold missiles to the Middle East, not only to Iran, but also to Syria. They are also behind the Pakistani missile program. So we see a lot of this. And we've seen them spread nuclear technology. I mean, this is not a potential problem. The facility in Al-Kibar in Syria was built with the assistance, this was an undeclared facility, and it was built with the assistance of North Korean experts. So this is a problem. I mean, even in this part of the world, this is a direct problem to our security. So we need to take that very seriously. And indeed, we failed to do that when they withdrew from the treaty. We've always have difficulties in putting forward strong reactions when they misbehave, to put it mildly, by testing missiles or by testing nuclear devices. It has to do with the complicated relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang, because obviously the Chinese are not in favor of a nuclear North Korea, but what they fear the most is the collapse of North Korea. So they tend to accommodate some of their concern, and it's a very tricky problem indeed. But we certainly should take it as seriously as we take the Iranian case, even though the Europeans are not on the forefront of the negotiation for that. On the issue of peaceful uses, I think it's indeed a bit of the forgotten debate in NPT conferences for the reasons Ambassador Kelly referred to. But in a way, I think we could revisit that through a series of issues. One is to say nuclear cooperation is a legitimate demand from countries that want to acquire technology to produce nuclear electricity. What are the conditions for this demand to be met? And there we probably could discuss a little further what are the conditions. what sort of technology is accessible on the market, how robust should the technology be in terms of safety, security, and non-proliferation. I think it's a key element as the technology will continue to spread in the world. Are there technologies, and I do believe so, that are not for sale, or that at least are not easily for sale? Enrichment, reprocessing are two key examples. And of course, the Netherlands, because of its role in enrichment technology, is very central in that debate. We need to be engaging countries, and I think on the one hand, it's true and normal to acknowledge that access to the peaceful benefits of nuclear technology, whether in the medicine field, in energy production, are legitimate. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that full access to all technology is there. I was quite struck to see that the NPT, which until 1995 was somehow paying a tribute to the value of export control regimes, stopped doing so in 2000. And this was, I think, a mistake by those who were in the room to just sort of push that aside, because I believe the nuclear export control regime, the nuclear suppliers group, have a value in this context and should be, on the one hand, doing outreach exercise to explain how they work, but should not be pointed at as a sort of illegitimate arrangements. So I think it's important. And finally, it is complicated, and this is maybe a lesson for some EU countries. I mean, we all make different decisions with regard to nuclear energy. There are those who are strongly opposed, there are those who are careful, there are those who are strongly engaged into nuclear energy. It is difficult sometimes and to engage with countries that want to access nuclear technology by having a policy that is in a way contrary to the spirit of Article 4 of the NPT, that is promoting nuclear cooperation. And here I'm specifically, again, I'm being the rude academic quoting examples, but I'm specifically thinking of, for instance, the ambiguous position of Austria, that as a national position goes against nuclear cooperation because it doesn't want by any means to promote nuclear cooperation. And it's sometimes very complicated to engage with countries that are just saying, well, we don't care about your national position. What we know is that we want to see engagement on that. And that's a tricky thing that we need to address ourselves as well. Thank you.
Let's take final 3 questions.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your excellent, enlightening presentations. For me, the only hilarious thing is probably for 20 years I hear this metaphor about glass half full, half empty. And I think that we have 2 schools here. We have something what they call positivist or legalistic school of this arms control mafia who travels from conference to conference, sits in all committees and commissions, United Nations, the IAEA, and who believe in the letter of the treaty. And there's like a new school of thought. I'm not speaking about counter-proliferation, but about regional solutions, that you can solve the most burning issues, I mean problems with proliferation, be it North Korea, Iran, and so on, without taking into account purely political or regional situation on the ground, and arranging some kind of conference, for example, how to alleviate Iranian anxieties, and actually how to give them some assurances, speaking the same about North Koreans who, I mean, arguably ready even to give up nuclear weapons option if proper US assurance are given to them. But speaking in terms of Article 6, that we are as nuclear weapon states obliged to go forward with disarmament, for me it's very deplorable that President Obama has snatched the traditional Russian or Soviet slogan of nuclear disarmament, that in Moscow now probably nuclear disarmament is a dirty word. You know, people prefer to speak about, you know, nuclear build-up. And some people even pretending that reset policy is fading away, that we reached a kind of plateau, and we know that the Russian position now on arms control is a packaging, which reminds me the beginning of the 80s, that nothing is settled until everything is settled, and You can't approach tactical, non-strategic nuclear weapons until you do with ABM, until you do with weaponization of space, until you do guarantees on conventional weapons, and so on and so forth. But I can't fail to ask this question. Unfortunately, Gary, it's to you, and I am using every avenue, to torture my, high-placed American friends. Speaking about the continuation of the process, and I strongly believe in this because we're all, I think, great adepts of arms control and non-proliferation. What do you think, with all the difficulties, with all this situation, with all the backlogs, with all this situation that we reached the plateau, and some, as we spoke about this yesterday, some Russian military think that we can't go down further until we solve all this issue. What, in your view, would be the practical issue, just priority practical issue, which could be solved the first and break all this ice in arms control and non-proliferation? It's a banal question, but it would be very interesting to listen to your answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cindy Vestergaard, Danish Institute for International Studies. When we talk about the NPT, we talk about the two tiers, the nuclear haves and the have-nots. But the NPT actually created a third tier as well, what I call the non-haves that have. Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea, if we include that it has withdrawn. But we also created a fourth tier now with the exemption by the Nuclear Suppliers Group for India. And I'd like to ask the panelists what they think about the consequences or effects of this in terms of nuclear governance, how this actually creates, where you have now 30 years later, actual, what would you call, legitimate trade with a non-NPT state, with a state that actually took technology for peaceful uses and turned it into nuclear weapons program.
Thank you. The gentleman in the first row.
Thank you very much. My name is Szymon Bocheński. I'm from the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much for invitation. And thank you very much all the speakers for presentations and for interesting discussion. Especially Camille for your report from the workshop. The transparency, nuclear transparency is of special importance to Poland, and we are quite active on this issue both in NATO, and we are now doing some interesting work as a part of the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative. Thank you, Stefan, for mentioning NPDI. I would like to pose two questions, one regarding Iran, since this issue overshadowed our discussions here, dominated it. In connection to the new round of talks we are having now, do you think that P5+1 should prepare or present a new or refreshed package of incentives to Iran prior to the Baghdad talks? We have been pursuing this double-track approach for some time already, but it seems to me that this second track, I'm not talking about sanctions, is a little bit underinvested. And the second issue is nuclear weapon-free zone, WMD free zone in the Middle East. This issue was pivotal for the 2010 outcome, and I think will also dominate the current discussions. What shall we expect? What kind of result would be satisfactory for us during the 2012 conference, Alison?
I'll ask the speakers in the reverse order. Camille, final words.
Let me tackle some of the very important issues that have been raised. On the WMD free zone in the Middle East, the debate has started, and we can now expect that the conference will take place in 2012, hosted by the Finns. I think we all gave credit to the Finnish facilitator for working on that seriously. I don't believe, to be honest, that this conference will be the opportunity to discuss a draft treaty or to make extraordinarily significant leap forward on this. I think it is interesting to note that in the process running to this, all the countries from the region have accepted to engage. We, as I'm chairing the EU Non-Proliferation Consortium, we organized for the EU an event in Brussels last July, which was quite successful because everyone came. That was a first step, and everyone engaged as well. What we need to take into account is the fact that there are very different approaches to this, and that there are very significant security concerns associated with this process. So if we want the Israelis to feel comfortable in a process that they've not been associated with the negotiation of, we need to take into account their legitimate security concerns with regard to the process of this. And this is not a treaty that will take place in a vacuum. It will take place in a security environment that will need to evolve in order to facilitate steps towards that. Then, having said this, I do believe that incremental steps can be taken by all the countries in the region to fulfill that objective, that there are plenty of treaties that have not been signed or ratified by countries in the region, including, I will name just a few, but there are plenty of others. If you look at the Biological Weapon Convention, if you look at the Chemical Weapon Convention. So short of the issue of the relationship between Israel and the NPT and Iran and the NPT, there are other issues that are important there. I would believe that some sort of confidence-building measures with regard to missiles, which is part of the bargain, is extraordinarily important in the region. So I think there are plenty of steps that can be taken and move in that direction. I sense some sort of positive momentum for that. We will see where the Finnish conference goes. On a new package of incentives for Iran, I'm a bit puzzled at that, because we've in the period from 2004 to 2006, we've kept putting new incentives, and the situation got worse. So I'm wondering if we can do much better in terms of incentives. I think for the moment, indeed, the incentives is to engage in some sort of incremental process where the Iranians get something in return for the steps they would take. But I would very much like to see some steps taken by the Iranians before we start thinking about the new package for them. On the 1-2-3 deal with India, I mean, it was a very complicated issue. It was the issue is it better to have the Indians in the regime to a certain extent, or to keep them out of the regime? It was it was an excruciating dilemma in many ways, and the path taken so far has been to shift from a position of keeping them out of the regime to bringing them in to a certain degree. I'm not sure we got a lot in return for that at the moment. I think it's important. What I credit the Indians for is for having a good track record in terms of exports so far. So again, it's a lesser evil package. Finally, and I can't resist tackling the issue of zero and having a French discussing the Prague Agenda, you couldn't escape that. With two things. Zero is recognized as a sort of ultimate objectives in a variety of statements, documents, and things like that. I would question the fact, I think we should have there is a legitimate debate to take place on whether it's both desirable and credible. And this is something that we need to seriously think about. Because there are I would say, circumstances under which zero would not be desirable. There are circumstances under which zero would not be credible. But nevertheless, we need to work, and I think that's the commitment of everyone, on how to move towards establishing the conditions on the one hand, and also I genuinely believe that a lot of progress can be achieved towards zero, and that we somehow should leave open the issue of what is the end goal or the end state that we want to achieve in 15, 20, 50, or 100 years, and focus on those immediate steps. And there are plenty of them that are there, and we all mentioned them. The CTBT is not enforced, the FMCT is not being negotiated, further cuts can be done, further transparency can be created. And I think that now that we have this sort of ultimate objective that is there, we also need to focus on concrete steps as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. On the India deal, Ireland was actually the last holdout. I was also our negotiator for that, and we were the last people in the room to agree. We went along with this extremely reluctantly. That said, we absolutely recognise the right of India to seek secure, to seek its own, to fill its energy needs, and to look for that. We agreed the exemption in September 2008, and that's the track we're in. We've agreed it. So now the focus has to be on implementing it, that all sides live up to that commitment. And the fact that you didn't like it at the time doesn't mean that you're not in that track, and that India must live up to its commitments there, and the NSG must monitor implementation of that deal. On the Middle East conference, I believe that getting everyone into the room is fundamental. Again, it's the start of a process. What the 2010 text does is emphasizes the importance of a process. So the most important thing is getting that process started. Now, I think that to get that process started and to set it on the correct track, it will be very important that basic principles are agreed, that there's some path laid out for the way ahead, and that there is agreement to meet. Again, the 2010 text takes the process up to 2015. The facilitator reports to each of the PrepComs in 2012, 2013, 2014, and to the review conference. And then the review conference looks at that. I believe that there is great scope, as Camille has said, for confidence-building steps, and that many of them don't have to be undertaken directly in a bilateral context, but again in a multilateral framework. There are many treaties to which the states in the region have neither signed nor ratified, and that there's great scope there to start the confidence building. On zero, of course, for a country like Ireland, we're absolutely thrilled, as I said at the beginning, at the Prague Agenda and at the start of this discussion of getting towards zero. But that said, we have to sit down and start where we are. We still have 20,000 nuclear weapons in the world, and we have to agree practical steps to reduce that arsenal, and then take the issues of zero as we get nearer the time. It's a different set of issues at that time, and we are some way away. We agree it as a goal, but then we start now step by step with the steps that are laid out in the NPT. It is really important to bring in the holdouts, India, Pakistan, and Israel into the regime. And it's fundamental that, as Article 6 says, that there is a treaty. There will have to be a long-term treaty, and this is where we're talking about the work for a nuclear weapons convention, which of course has to be our goal. I mean, we don't believe we're just at the stage yet of negotiating a weapons convention, and we would like to be at the stage of negotiating a nuclear weapons convention now. We would dearly love to be there. That said, as I said in my presentation, Article 6 is the only legally binding commitment we have at the moment. So we must, in parallel with work to start the preparations for a nuclear weapons convention, we have to keep our eye firmly on the ball of getting the nuclear weapons states to implement Article 6. Thank you.
On the prospects for future agreements between the US and Russia on nuclear disarmament and in the security area in general, I do not necessarily share the gloomy outlook that some have presented on this. And allow me to repeat an example which I already brought at the workshop yesterday, but which I find really striking. When we had the recent statements coming from Moscow that in reaction to NATO's building up of a missile defense capability, Russia would consider putting additional missiles into the Kaliningrad Oblast, the NATO Secretary General issued a press statement. Now, in Cold War times, that press statement probably would have said, if the Russians do that, we will retaliate in kind and also put up additional missiles somewhere. What he actually said in his statement was just, what a waste of money. And I think that shows that the situation has changed, and that what we actually have to address here is a difference in threat perceptions. We think that the Russians are actually obsessed with a threat which is not a real one, and that there are very real threats that we should face together. So I think this only shows that there is a need to pursue the relaunch of US-Russia relations and seriously address these problems of threat perceptions which underlie all the difficulties we have, be it in the nuclear area or in our efforts to modernize the conventional arms control regime in Europe. On the India exemption, I think certainly a lot can be said in criticism of that decision. But on the other hand, we have not really made much headway in our efforts to bring India closer into the global non-proliferation regime before. And on the basis of the decision that was made, I think there are some opportunities here, and it now matters to pursue these opportunities. Regarding the question on Iran, and do we need a new package put on the table for the next meeting in Baghdad? I think the issue at this first meeting in Istanbul, and Gary Samer can say a lot more about this because he was present, but was to sound out whether Iran is really seriously ready to engage on this issue. And at the last meeting in Istanbul, which fell apart, this was certainly not the case. There are indications that there is a renewed readiness on the part of Iran to engage on the issue, but still we have to put them to the test on this. And I don't think there is a need to come up with any new packages, but rather to consider a process that has to be started in order to really get into a negotiation mode with Iran. And finally, on the WMD-free zone in the Middle East, just a small remark. So far, the security conceptions in the region have very much been focused either on national approaches to ensure national security, or to call for some kind of international engagement to take basically the problems into the hands of the international community. But what is absolutely missing is a regional security dialogue, a regional approach to cooperative security. And if the conference can start a process leading to such a regional security dialogue, then I think it will indeed be a success, and that's what we have to go for. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to say this has been a really interesting and useful discussion and panel presentations. On zero, of course, people remember that half of President Obama's Prague speech was to talk about achieving a world without nuclear weapons, but the other half of his speech talked about the U.S. maintaining an effective nuclear force for as long as nuclear weapons exist in order to defend the United States and its allies. And that's not only for deterrence, that's also for non-proliferation. To the extent that U.S. allies can depend upon the U.S. to protect them with our own nuclear weapons, it removes incentives for them to develop nuclear weapons themselves. And that's particularly relevant in Asia, where Japan and South Korea face a long-term nuclear threat from North Korea. So President Obama made it clear that, yes, in the long term, we seek a world without nuclear weapons, but for the immediate future, we have to maintain our nuclear forces, and they have to be effective. And he pointed out that nuclear disarmament may not happen in his lifetime. So I think we tried to balance, on one hand, the vision of achieving a world without nuclear weapons, and on the other hand, the practicality of recognizing that in today's international politics, far as the US is concerned, maintaining nuclear forces is essential. As I said, not only for defense, but also for non-proliferation. In terms of, Victor asked about first priority. I do think from the discussions that President Obama has had with President Medvedev, we do have a sense that unless we can address the missile defense issue, we're not likely to make much headway on further reductions, and we have some ideas that we want to discuss with Russia on missile defense. So I think that will clearly be one of the top issues. We would also like to start a discussion on questions of strategic stability, because we believe, the study that the US is doing, I think will conclude that we have far more nuclear weapons than we need to deter a Russian nuclear attack against the United States. And we hope we will be able to persuade Russia that it also has far too many nuclear weapons, to deter an American attack. So we want to talk a little bit about the philosophy of nuclear forces, and I think that may help to provide a basis for eventually reaching agreement that both sides are comfortable with less nuclear weapons. On the India deal, well, I was outside of government, so it was easy for me to criticize the Bush administration. I understand they made a geopolitical calculation that improving U.S.-India relations was more important than preserving the principle of the non-proliferation regime. I completely understand, that's just ordinary power politics. I also agree that there hasn't been much to show for it, but I think anything with India takes a long time. And the Indians have, of course, applied to join the various export control regimes, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Australia Group, Vasanar, NTCR, and so forth. And I think over time, over a long period of time, we will be able to draw them in. To me, one of the biggest downsides of the India deal is that the countries who've now been left out, Israel and Pakistan, are saying, what about us? And in fact, one of the big obstacles to starting the FMCT negotiations in Geneva is that the Pakistanis have said to the United States, if you agree to treat us like India and agree to have a civil nuclear cooperation agreement with us, then we will agree to let the FMCT negotiations begin. And of course, it's politically impossible for the US and Pakistan to have such an agreement. So that's actually made the FMCT stalemate even worse than it was before. On Iran, I agree with my fellow panelists that we don't really need a new package of incentives. We've been more than generous in terms of making offers to the Iranians over the years. My sense is that the primary Iranian motivation right now is much more concern about sanctions than concern that they're not being offered enough. And I think if we're able to reach agreement on steps to constrain their nuclear activities, it will be primarily because the Iranians are looking for ways to relieve sanctions or to avoid additional sanctions. So I think our strategy has actually been very effective. The US, EU, Japan, ROK, and so forth, all the countries that are working together to increase pressure on Iran, I think it's brought them back to the table. The question will be whether we can translate that leverage into concrete actions that Iran will take to constrain its nuclear program, and it remains to be seen. Finally, on the famous WMD conference, as Camille said, there are fundamental differences among the parties in terms of their approach toward achieving a regional arms control agreement. And such agreements have to emerge from the parties. All of the nuclear weapons free zones, whether it's Latin America or Southeast Asia or South Pacific or Africa, they've always been the product of regional negotiations, and outside parties cannot substitute for an agreement among the parties themselves. And I also agree with Camille that one can imagine some modest but positive outcomes that could emerge from such a conference. But the last thing I want to say is that we also have to recognize that since 2010, the developments in the region, this wave of revolution and civil war that we've seen, has very profoundly complicated prospects for organizing this meeting. It would be hard enough in the Middle East to organize such a conference without having the instability and uncertainty that we are looking at in the Middle East, including just the simple fact that governments are very distracted. I mean, in Egypt, they're setting up a new political system, so they don't have that much leftover energy to figure out how to run this conference. And until there's a little bit more stability in the region and certainty, I think it will become, that it will make things much more difficult for us to organize this meeting and have a positive outcome. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to, first of all, thank to all the panelists and to the audience. I think you were so attentive. It seems to me that it was interesting to everyone participating. I would like to apologize that I didn't stick to the timetable. But if you permit, I would ask you to limit the break for 10 minutes. As you may have noticed, you can take your coffee to your place for the next session. And now join me in thanking loudly the participants of this panel.